Thanks so much for joining us here on Atlanta News First Plus. I'm Joy Lim Nakarin. Today marks a very somber anniversary. It has been 2 years since a deadly rampage at 3 spas in the state of Georgia claimed 8 lives. We really want to focus on the victims today and paying tribute to them. And there are commemoration events across the state of Georgia to remember these lives lost. But also, there are steps that lawmakers are taking and community members are taking to make sure that this sort of tragedy never happens again. That's why today we've invited in a very special guest, Representative Marvin Lim, Democrat, joining us here. Thank you so much for being with us, Representative Lim. We really appreciate you being here, especially on a day that I know you've been very busy. Can you start with sharing with us what it is you've been doing today?
Thank you, Joy. It is a privilege to be here today. Among the other things that I and my colleagues did today in the Georgia General Assembly was to stand at the well of the House and read the names of the 8 victims of the tragedy from March 16th, 2021. It has been 2 years. A lot has changed, and for most people, this is not going to be on their minds every day, but certainly for the family members. And I will say, Mr. Michaels was actually a constituent of mine, of whom I did not know moved to my area until after he had tragically been killed. All of their families and loved ones continue to live with this. So that's why it was important for us, among the many activities of the day, to actually commemorate those 8 people in their honor and for their loved ones.
Absolutely. So obviously paying tribute to them and keeping them in mind is one of the top priorities today. But just on behalf of your constituents, I know that you've done a lot of work to make sure that this sort of thing never happens again. I know that you've done a lot of work specifically in the area of community relations with police. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why it's so important?
Yes, absolutely. I have seen my charge, even before what happened 2 years ago, but especially since then, to help build those relationships between community members among themselves, and as well as particularly with law enforcement. One of the tragedies that we saw on that day was the fact that people in the Asian Pacific American community, although not even only them, have a fear of police, and some of that can be justified. And on that day, we know that there were troubles ensuring that someone could respond in language in Korean to those calling for help. I think in my community especially, there can be that fear and mistrust or lack of understanding of law enforcement, yet at the same time an acknowledgement that law enforcement is important, such as for responding to crimes, including hate crimes. So a lot of my work at the local, state, as well as even the federal level has been trying to figure out ways that community members will feel more willing to report to law enforcement or even just talk to law enforcement, and conversely, for law enforcement to truly be in those communities and truly listen to the needs of those community members, whatever their culture, whatever their language.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing we have been discussing is an issue that maybe can be hard to grasp for some people. The majority of the victims were Asian American women. This has now been charged as a hate crime, but initially there was some resistance to that in the community. There were many individuals who didn't see this as a hate crime, something you and I were discussing off camera. Why is it important to acknowledge this as a hate crime? I guess what can we do to kind of raise awareness about the issue of hate crimes and specifically AAPI hate?
Absolutely. It's important to many members of the community. And here I want to recognize people can differ in their opinions even among one community. But it is important to many folks in the community to recognize this as a hate crime because they don't want to feel erased. The perpetrator himself, in his own words, recognized that he was going after women. And committing crimes specifically against women is a form of hate crime. It's a gender-based hate crime. Of course, there's been more conversation and perhaps debate around whether this was specifically targeting Asians, and I think it's important to recognize that not all the victims were Asians, not all the victims were women, but that conversation can still be valid given the circumstances. And for so many people, it's important to recognize this as an Asian targeting hate crime because so many folks have felt within the Asian Pacific American community erased, and we have seen so many incidents of crimes against Asian Americans in our country. So for validation, it's important to so many people. That said, this was a tragedy that speaks to many of the problems that I think we need to continue to tackle in order for people to not feel invalidated. We need to continue to look at how to prevent these crimes, which is why it's so important to actually build relationships with diverse communities. And we need to ensure that even when we can't prevent something, because we can't prevent everything, that people, again, actually do report to law enforcement. So for many people, that's why they feel that recognition of this as a hate crime is important because it feels that to them like they're being validated by law enforcement and by government. But regardless of whether we do that or not, we can still look at how to prevent this, and we can still look to what we can do when something happens, so that when something happens, people are actually reporting it and something is being done, rather than so many incidents of against Asian Americans, against women being hidden, because as much as we've seen an uptick, there's so many that still aren't even reported and that we don't even know about.
Yeah, and something that you and I were just discussing off camera is that the number of incidents of Asian American hate being reported has really skyrocketed in recent years. But we were just having a discussion about whether it's that there are more incidents, and certainly that must play a role, or is it that there's more consciousness about reporting, that some of the community members who maybe culturally were kind of conditioned not to report, or it really didn't come naturally to kind of complain or do what they saw as complaining, are now being encouraged and now becoming aware that it is important to speak up and to come forward and let authorities know when something happens.
Absolutely. And it's important to recognize that all of those things can be true. For example, as Asian Pacific Americans make themselves more visible, they will feel more empowered to report crimes or other problems that they are experiencing. At the same time, it is not difficult to draw a connection directly between Asian Americans, or really any group, particularly those that have been traditionally disempowered, starting to make their voices heard, reporting things, to draw a line between that and people who have traditionally not had to see them or been more in power, them feeling threatened by the rise of people claiming their voices and their power. So to me, it's quite possible, even quite likely, that both are true. That is, that Asian Americans, more minorities, are feeling comfortable reporting these crimes, but that as Asian Americans are claiming their space in politics or in civic engagement, our society, that more people feel threatened by them. So I think both are actually true.
So as we have been discussing kind of what constitutes a hate crime and what sort of hate crime this was, that, as you said, the shooter essentially said he was targeting women, so certainly would constitute a hate crime against women. But there has still continued to be a lot of debate within the AAPI, within the broader community, about whether this crime was targeting Asian Americans, even though most of the victims were Asian Americans. And I just kind of wanted to take the opportunity to discuss with you something that I think that, I've been discussing in my newsrooms off camera, which is about the sort of nature of racism against Asian Americans and against Asian American women specifically, which is, in my view, and I hesitate to give opinions as a journalist, in my view, is a misogynistic sort of, it's misogynistic in its tone. Can you kind of share a little bit about that? Because I know obviously you have many important Asian American women in your life, from your own mother.
Absolutely. And You are saying very important things because, as I just mentioned, two things can be true at the same time. One does not have to be true at the expense of another. I think there is a great agreement that what happened in March of 2021 was a hate crime against women. It is possible also that it was a hate crime against an Asian people, but even without recognizing that in the moment, you bring up a very good point. Well, is it the fact that they were Asian women? And is it even the fact that they were Asian women who were immigrants who were laboring in these spas, which are not easy places to work in, that were not necessarily earning a lot of money? So when you start to put in all of these backgrounds, experiences, and identities, I think you add more nuance to the conversation, which is important not only for intellectual purposes or not even just for the purposes of charging a hate crime, because whether you charge this as a hate crime or not, you're still having to deal with the reality of needing to validate what happened to people and again needing to prevent it. And I think we do all of that better by recognizing the nuances of the many identities that intersected or were possible here. And I think you hit on arguably the main one, which is that these were Asian women toiling rather under difficult conditions, and it created an environment where a perpetrator was unfortunately successfully able to murder so many of them. So we continue to need to focus on Asian women and the conditions that they're working in and living in.
Yeah, and and perhaps I am personalizing it too much just from my own personal experience, but having heard one too many kind of rude comments and slurs that are very demeaning to Asian American women, that I would say are kind of ways of hypersexualization, for instance. We see that this kind of mentality can be very, very dangerous, but. I want to ask you kind of what else should we be doing in our communities so that we just ensure not only basic safety but just respect among each other.
Yes, I think there are a couple of things that we continue to need to do in our communities. One is even before or concurrent with forming relationships with government, participating in the civic sphere, reporting to law enforcement, all of that. Oftentimes in a community like mine, and I'm in the Atlanta area where about 50% of my constituents are actually foreign-born immigrants, including myself. I immigrated from the Philippines when I was 7. There are a lot of people that might not even know each other. So certainly when there's a time of trouble, they don't feel like they have anyone to turn to. And in many cases, even law enforcement themselves would say, you probably shouldn't necessarily turn to law enforcement first, but if people in these conditions don't have anyone to turn to, then it's going to create or exacerbate the problem. So again, the first thing that we can do is how do we actually build relationships within our community, which is very difficult work. Very quickly in my district, by the end of this summer, I will have knocked on about 21,500 doors in my district, which is the number of households. And that's one pass. And the work still has much to go. So we need to continue to invest and not just say, let's build community relations, but actually invest the many resources it will take to do that. And then secondly, and quickly, we do need to continue working with law enforcement. Just last week, not with the Asian Pacific American community, but with the Latino or Hispanic community, my county police department, because of recent incidents with opioids and gang deaths, did a forum in Spanish and English with those members of the community that don't often turn out. We need to have more of that. If we keep saying that people need to listen to each other, we actually need to create a forum where people do that and not just pay lip service to that. And again, that will take a lot of investment, but that's something that we can all push our neighborhoods, our HOAs, our apartment complexes, our law enforcement, our local governments to have those forums, to have those places where we can build that trust among each other and with police and ourselves as regular citizens.
Yeah, and moving forward, obviously these forums, like you said, are really important venues for people to listen to each other and have dialogue and create some understanding. And I know it's something that you've done. You've tried to facilitate for community members between each other, also between community members and police. What else do you think that we can do, even as individuals, just make sure that everyone is safe and that everyone's respected.
Absolutely. I think the number one thing that we can do is to really not just listen, but meet people where they are. Because we are today acknowledging horrible murders that happened. We've already said that there are so many more incidents, tragedies that aren't being reported that we don't even know about. And those incidents aren't just incidents of murder, but think of incidents of domestic violence. Think again of instances of opioid deaths, which again is so prevalent among so many communities in America. Think of gang violence. Think of suicides. Think of all of these issues where the government, particularly law enforcement, might be involved, and see how that is presenting itself, manifesting itself in our communities. Because if we can have conversations with people about the issues that they care about, even if they don't at first rise to the level of serial murder, essentially, that's how we actually build that trust, so that when something truly or something gigantically horrible happens, we've all already built that low level, or we've already have built the trust on other lower level issues to be able to address the larger ones.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I would just say, I will repeat by saying I know so many people aren't thinking about this every day, and that makes sense. But we are here commemorating this so that we don't forget, the lives that were lost, but also said that we continue to learn the lessons. And we have come a long way. I was very privileged to design a course for state law enforcement, actually enforcement throughout Georgia, on how to interact with multicultural, multilingual communities. So we have made some progresses. We've talked about how more people are reporting, but that is only a drop in the bucket of what needs to continue to happen. So I hope that by next year, on the third and then the fourth and the fifth anniversary, we'll have had a lot of these forums. We'll have had built up more of that trust, because there are no shortage of problems impacting these communities, and we really need to do the work and not just respond when something bad has already happened.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Representative Marvin Lim, for joining us today, marking this somber 2-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings. And we so appreciate all the hard work that you've been doing in the community to make sure that we're all safe and that we're all respected.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you. And of course, we're going to continue our coverage here on Atlanta News First Plus and our over-the-air broadcast, our traditional television broadcast on Atlanta News First. My colleague Rachel Aragon will have a report coming up at 4 p.m. taking a closer look at events taking place across the state of Georgia today in order to commemorate these victims. Of course, we want to continue to honor and remember them. And I just want to leave you with this look at the victims as we remember them today.